Peyton Manning threw for over 400 yards 14 times, and yet he never made the 500 club. His highest total ever was 479 yards. All right. Welcome to Just the Stats NFL, the show that covers the NFL statistical leaders from the all-time greats to the current players leading the NFL. I'm Ernie Jennings, your host. So on this episode of Just the Stats NFL, I just wanted to take a look around. And what I mean by that is no particular team, but a couple of records that I find interesting, a couple of stats that got me going down a rabbit hole. So the first one is most passing yards in a single game. And I've talked about this in other aspects when we're looking at stats overall and so forth, but I wanted to look at it a little more in depth because it's just fascinating to me who's involved with this particular record. And the second record I want to look at is the most receiving yards in a single game, and some of the same reasons, like who holds the record and so forth like that. And it's the randomness of the players involved in these two categories that got me interested. So we're going to take a look at that, and I'll explain what I mean as we get going on these two stats, these two very specific stats, and that's all we're going to look at in this episode. So let's get this episode of Just the Stats NFL going. So the first one I want to look at is the single game passing yards. This is very interesting to me because this is a record that has been around for 74 years. That's one of the things that got me interested. You know, we talk about all the time the passing game and how it's exploded over the last, 25 years, and it just keeps increasing, the passing game, so forth. And yet, this is a record that has not been broken for 74 years. The record is held by Norm Van Brocklin with 554 yards in a single game. Has not been broken, not really that closely even gotten to. So just to kind of set the stage, let me just say that for this particular record, it's happened 25 times that a quarterback is throwing for 500 or more yards. And it's been done by 22 quarterbacks. Ben Roethlisberger was able to accomplish the feat 3 times, Drew Brees 2 times, and every other person 1 time. 3 of the players are Hall of Famers, that being Norm Van Brocklin, Warren Moon, and Dan Marino. Now, you got 3 or 4 more that will be future Hall of Famers with Matthew Stafford, Tom Brady, and Drew Brees, and then possibly Eli Manning. Those are, 3 of them for sure, first-round Hall of Famers. I wouldn't doubt any one of the 3. And then Eli Manning, maybe as well. But those are the 4 right now, and there's some other current quarterbacks that could move up this list, and we'll look at them later as far as maybe being in the Hall of Fame someday down the road. Now, so like I said, this stat along with the next one just got me interested for various reasons. Another one is that when we're looking at these quarterbacks, so like I said, Ben Roethlisberger accomplished the feat 3 times. Pretty impressive out of the 25. But when you're looking at, for example, the most times passing for 300 or more yards in a career, Drew Brees holds the record with 98, Peyton Manning 93, and Tom Brady was 71. Those are your top 3. And then when it comes to most times passing for 400 or more yards, Drew Brees did it 16 times, Peyton Manning 14, and Tom Brady 14. So incredible. Peyton Manning, so this is one of the interesting facts. Peyton Manning threw for over 400 yards 14 times, and yet he never made the 500 club. His highest total ever was 479 yards. So somewhat close, but really not close. I mean, not there to make this list of the top 25 times. So it's interesting how many times he threw for 300 or 400 yards, and he never quite made it to 500. You wouldn't have guessed. If you had to guess people, you wouldn't have thought he would not be on the list. So that's pretty interesting to me. So let's just take a look at some of these players. And what I wanted to see was, I'll just take a look at the top 3 players because it's fascinating, the comparison of their careers. 2 of them are actually Hall of Famers, Norm Van Brocklin and Warren Moon. But very different in yardage and types of things like that. So Norm Van Brocklin, like I said, has the record with 554 yards. He played 12 years, 140 games, and that was his best game. So in 1951, he threw for 550 yards, 554 yards to be exact. Incredible. I mean, it really is. Here's the funny thing about it is that his next highest game in his entire career was in 1957 when he threw for 328 yards. He only had 5 games over 300 yards. And this is and then the one game over the high he had was 328. The next highest game for him is 226 yards higher. It's incredible the difference in his highest totals. I mean, no other quarterback is like that. Every other quarterback pretty much has at least 300s and 400 games, at least the top 3. And if I went through every one, I'm pretty sure that the ones I'm looking at for the most part had some other 300 games and some games way higher than 328 yards in their career. So that was very interesting to me about Norm Van Brocklin. 1, he's held this record since 1951, and 2, his next best game was so far below the first one. Just incredible. Now, one last thing about Norm Van Brocklin was not only was he a quarterback, he was also the punter. For his career, he had a 42.7 yard average, and in 1954, he led the NFL with a 44.6 yards per game average. So he's out there passing and punting. Pretty good player. Now, the next player, and this is what kind of got my attention, was about this particular stat when you look down the list, and we'll look at it a little bit. But the 2 players, Matt Schaub and Warren Moon, tied for second with 527 yards. They both played for Houston, one for the Houston Oilers. Well, they both played for Houston. One for the Houston Texans, actually, I should say, and Warren Moon for the Houston Oilers. So actually 2 different teams if you follow their lineage. But Matt Schaub tied for the second most ever. He had a game in 2012 when he threw for 527 yards. So he played for 16 years, played 155 games, so 4 more years than Norm Van Brocklin, but only 15 more games. I should say that Norm Van Brocklin, well, yeah, that's the total for him. But looking at Matt Schaub, I'm sorry about that little caveat there, but Matt Schaub, 527 yards he had in 2012. But he did have 4 games over 400. He actually had one was 497, so he almost made this list twice. And he had 24 games over 300 yards. So that's pretty impressive. But not somebody you would ever think. Little interesting thing about him was that, like I said, it was in 2012 when he threw for 527 yards. 2013 was his last season as a regular starter. And then way in 2019, which was very near the end of the year before the end of his season, of his career, I mean, he had 1 game he played, and he passed for 460 yards in that 1 game. So that was one of his 4 games, but it was 6 years after he had been a regular starter. So it was unfortunately for him, it was in a loss to Seattle, 27-20. But it's just interesting to compare him, who is nowhere near a Hall of Fame kind of player, but he is up in the top 3 with another Hall of Famer, Warren Moon, who also tied Matt Schaub. Now, Warren Moon is a Hall of Famer and one of the most prolific passers, and probably, I can't remember if it still would be the same over Tom Brady or not, but if you counted his Canadian football time with his NFL time, he might be the most prolific passer in the history of football, professional football. But Warren Moon played 17 years and 208 games, so quite a bit more than these other two. His best game was 527 yards. He had 3 touchdowns when they beat the Kansas City Chiefs in 1990. That was his best game. He had 6 games over 400 yards, and he had 42 games with 300 yards or more. So pretty good season for him. Those are your top players, the top 3. And like I said, I'm just looking at the difference in their careers. If you look at their stats and so forth, it's just amazingly different. Norm Van Brocklin, way back in the 50s, had his career. And then you had Matt Schaub in the 90s and the 2000s, and Warren Moon in the 90s. Very different players. Warren Moon's the one guy that obviously expect him to be up there, and Matt Schaub, you don't. So when you're looking at the list of the players, there's 25 times it's happened. The next best is Joe Burrow. So here's a current player. He had 525 yards back in 2021. So he's the next one. You've got, so far on this list, there are five players that are active, that are on the list, who have thrown for 500 yards or more. That's pretty impressive, really. And Jameis Winston would be the 6th, but he had 497, and Jared Goff had 494. So they came close. But you have Joe Burrow, Matthew Stafford, Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins, and Dak Prescott. So out of those 5, obviously Kirk Cousins not starting right now, and Matthew Stafford's toward the end of his career, and then Dak Prescott, Joe Burrow on teams, and Jared Goff actually, but probably a little bit less. But Joe Burrow and Dak Prescott are on teams where they're going to be throwing the ball like crazy. Dak Prescott for the Dallas Cowboys because they don't really have a running game. And then Joe Burrow because they don't have a defense. So these are 2 players that could hit the 500-yard mark again. Very possible for one of those 2. I don't know so much for Jared Goff, but he did do it. He's done it twice. Once and twice he almost did it the second time with 494. So it's very possible. And in fact, Jared Goff in 2024 had the second best yardage. Actually, I should say the third, interestingly enough. Jameis Winston had 497 on December 2nd last year for this past season. Jared Goff on December 15th had 494. Now, what's interesting about that is Kirk Cousins beat the both of them when he had 509 to join this 500-yard list against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It was Atlanta Falcons against Tampa Bay Buccaneers on October 3rd, 2024. He had 509 yards to have the 15th best record as far as passing goes. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't something that he was able to replicate, and he was benched, for the final 3 games in favor of Penix for the Atlanta Falcons. So I don't see him ever improving on these numbers unless he goes to another team. Maybe he gets traded, their quarterback gets hurt, something like that. Or even Penix gets hurt. It could be a possibility. So those are some of the interesting things about that particular stat that I found interesting anyway. All right, one more. We'll go to single game receiving yards. And here's another one. This is even rarer occurrence. Only 6 times this has happened, and it's by 6 different players. Has a receiver had 300 or more yards. And again, this is what I found interesting about this was that, one, there's a little I don't want to say it's a discrepancy, but it depends on how you want to look at it, as far as who holds the record. But technically, Flipper Anderson, and this is one of the things that caught my eye, Flipper Anderson holds the record. In a game against the New Orleans Saints, which he was on the Los Angeles Rams, they beat the New Orleans Saints 20-17 in November 26, 1989. He had 15 receptions on 20 targets for 336 yards and 1 touchdown. That's the record. 336 yards and 1 touchdown. His longest catch was 50 yards. Now, here's the caveat for that. 42 yards of that total came in overtime. So he only made it over the 300-yard mark because of overtime. But it still counts in some circles. Now, if you say who's got the single game receiving yards and record in a regular no overtime game, then you have Calvin Johnson would be the guy for that. But Flipper Anderson's technically the leader in this category. So that's one interesting fact. The other one is that when you look at these, there's 6 of these players. On 2 of them, well, one, Calvin Johnson is a Hall of Famer, and the second one, Julio Jones, will be a Hall of Famer when he qualifies for that, because he just retired, so he's going to have to wait a few more years. But Flipper Anderson had a 10-year career, had played in 114 games, and had 267 receptions. The most receptions he ever had in a season were 51. So he had, in that one game, he had 15. Pretty incredible. And he had 2 1,000-yard seasons. So that's his career. And that's what makes it amazing. It was not an impressive career. He did have a couple of 1,000-yard seasons, but not much over 1,000. And yet, here he is holding a record. Now, Calvin Johnson is the second one on this list. He was playing for Detroit Lions when they beat the Dallas Cowboys 31-30 on October 27, 2013. He had 14 receptions on 16 targets for 329 yards, so only 7 yards behind Flipper Anderson. He had 1 TD, and he had a long catch of 87 yards. He had a 9-year career, so 1 year less than Flipper Anderson. And yet, instead of 267 receptions that Flipper had, Calvin Johnson had 731 receptions for 11,619 yards and 83 touchdowns. Quite a bit difference. And he played in 135 games versus the 114 that Flipper did in 10 years. So much more, much better seasons he had. He had 7 1,000-yard seasons in his career. And one of those in 2012, so this isn't even the year he set the record for most, almost set the record for most yards in a single game, which was in 2013. In 2012, he had 1,964 yards receiving in a single season, which is number 1 all time in that category. So just an amazing wide receiver. So he's somebody, you see such a contrast between him and Flipper Anderson, as well as the next guy, which is Stephon Page, who played for Kansas City. In 1985, in December 22nd of that year, Kansas City beat San Diego 38-34. Now, Stephon Page had 309 yards on only 8 catches. Pretty good. On 10 targets, he had 8 catches, 309 yards. So that's amazing. He's averaging over 35 yards a reception. But he had a long of 84 yards. He had 2 touchdowns. He had a career that lasted for 9 years, from 1983 to 1991. He played 125 games. So 10 games fewer than Calvin Johnson, and the same amount of years. But instead of Calvin Johnson had 731 receptions, Stephon Page had 377 for 6,341. So basically, just about half of the totals of Calvin Johnson. He did have 65 receptions in a single season. That's the most he had, 65 in a single season, which I forgot to mention that Calvin Johnson, his most receptions in a season was 122. Now, he didn't normally go over 100 receptions. I think that might have been his only time, but he still had 7 1,000-yard seasons. Calvin Johnson did. Stephon Page had one season where he had 65 receptions, and he had only one season where he had 1,000 yards and just barely over that. So quite a big difference in their careers, even though they had the same time span. So now you go to the holder of this record, who held the record for 55, let's see. Flipper Anderson set the record in 1989. The next guy is Jim Benton, who set the record in 1945. So 44 years Jim Benton held this record. He played for the Cleveland Rams at the time, and they beat the Detroit Lions 28-21 on November 22nd, 1945. He had 10 receptions for 303 yards, so he was the first player to ever go over 300 yards. And he had one TD, and he had a long catch of 70 yards. His career was 9 years as well, but he only played in 91 games. Now, they played only 14 back then, so you wouldn't have as many. He had 288 receptions for 4,801 yards. The most receptions he ever had in a single season was 63. So he had one 1,000-yard season. It's a big difference. 5 years later, Cloyce Box, another player who played this time for the Detroit Lions, when they beat the Baltimore Colts 45-21, on December 3rd, 1950, he had 302 yards on 12 receptions. He had 4 touchdowns in that game. His career only lasted 5 years, from 1949 to 1954, and he only played in 57 games total. So it's amazing. He's one of the holders of this 300 yards in a single game, and he only played 57 games. He only had 129 receptions in an entire career for 2,665 yards. And the most receptions he ever had in a single season was 50. And he actually did, even with 50, he was able to make one 1,000-yard season. A lot better yards per reception. So those are some of your players. Another interesting thing before I get to the final one, which is Julio Jones, was that there's 6 times this record has happened where 300 yards or more was achieved by a receiver. Interestingly enough, Detroit's involved in 3 of the 6. So kind of a strange little stat that is. But yeah, 3 of those times, Detroit Lions, either on one end or the other of that happening. Now, the last player, and the future Hall of Famer for sure, first round ballot, is Julio Jones, playing for the Atlanta Falcons when they beat the Carolina Panthers in 2016. They beat the Panthers 48-33. He had 12 receptions on 15 targets for exactly 300 yards. He had 1 TD, and he had a 75-yard bomb in that game. He played for 13 years from 2011 to 2023. So he's the most recent player to ever set this record. But he played in 166 games. Now he's just had an incredible career. 14 receptions in his career for 13,703 yards and 66 touchdowns. One season he had 136 receptions, which is tied for 4th all time as far as receptions go. He had 7 1,000-yard seasons, and one of those was for 1,871 yards in 2015, which is the 3rd all-time most yards in a single season. So he had an incredible career. So when you're looking at these guys, you're saying, wow, quite what a contrast between these 2, Calvin Johnson and Julio Jones, and the other 3 that made the list. It just goes to show you that in any game, at any time, just an odd stat could pop up and some random player can get to 300 yards. But it does not happen often, only 6 times in the entire history of the NFL. So it really is difficult. The next closest is Jimmy Smith for the Jacksonville Jaguars, had 291. He did that in the year 2000. But so there's only 6 players. And currently, you've got some players like Tyreek Hill. His best was 269 yards. So that's the next guy. You also have Jamar Chase, who had 266. And then he had 264 yards last year. So most recent player to have this many yards or even approach 300, and 264 really is still a fair distance away. But he did it last year against the Ravens on November 7th, 2024. So what makes that fascinating when you think about it is that you've got Jamar Chase, who's, pun intended, chasing 300 yards in a single game, and then he's got Joe Burrow, who's one of those that's thrown for over 500 yards in a game, playing together. So you would think if Burrow can have a 500-yard game passing, that Jamar Chase might be on the other end of 300 of those yards. So we'll see. But that's the most recent, Jamar Chase in 2024. So it's a record that's been around for a long time. 1989 was when it was set, so it's now going on 35 years. Been a long time, and it's been a long time, 10 years. Well, let's see. Well, it's been 8 years since anybody's hit the 300-yard mark, so we'll see what happens this year. That's just a little take on some odd stats that I found interesting. When I go through these stats, sometimes something just catches my eye, and I go off on a rabbit chase and end up way off the path that I intended to be on. Hope you enjoyed that little take. So now we only have 27 days left until the start of the regular season, and we've got playoff games going. So that's exciting. With the playoff games, at least you can start to see an idea of the lineups, who might be a starter, who's not a starter, that kind of thing. Also, we know we're getting closer because we're starting to see more drafts taking place. I was involved in a draft yesterday, in fact, earlier than I normally would want to do a draft because I always worry about, players getting hurt before the season even starts. But you know what? Anytime you can do a draft, it's a fun thing to do. Now I just hope that team is a good team. And I do have Jamar Chase. I happen to be the first pick in this draft, and I did take Jamar Chase, so I'm really pushing for him to have 300 yards in a single game. That would be awesome, especially if it was a championship game. So that's a little bit on that. Hope you're looking forward to the season, and if you're into fantasy football as I am, it's an exciting time as far as the drafting goes and picking your teams for the upcoming season. So my next podcast will be covering the Atlanta Falcons. We'll look at their 2024 season, their all-time greats, and we'll take a look at their 2025 season, where we think they stand in the overall scheme of things, as well as what fantasy players on that team are worth looking at and taking for your fantasy team. So hang around for that for the next podcast. You can find me on YouTube. If you have any comments, you can leave them on YouTube. You can also leave them on Facebook, X, Instagram, or at JusttheStatsNFL@gmail.com. Any of those, if you have any comments. Appreciate you listening. And so until next time, this is a wrap for this episode of Just the Stats NFL. I am out.